Good evening. Allow me to adapt the words of Harry Sinclair Lewis. Were I to express my feeling of honor and pleasure in having been invited to give this keynote, I should be fulsome and perhaps tedious. And so I present my gratitude with a plain thank you. I wish I were doing this in person in Nigeria, but COVID has made this impossible, as it has many other things. It feels almost contradictory, doesn't it, to talk of reimagining belongingness and its associated terms like identity and home, terms that conjure up comfort and peace and calm via a webcam, and at a time when a global pandemic is still ravaging parts of the world, at a time when the pandemic is forcing some of us still to remain anxiously isolated within our own borders, at a time when things are falling apart, at a time when the question of identity and belonging in Nigeria has never seemed more urgent, at a time when violence, particularly against women and girls, has been exacerbated by forced lockdowns of varying lengths in many countries across the globe, not just Nigeria. At a time when some Nigerians feel as if they do not belong, that they're being marginalized in their own country. At a time when we hear renewed talks of restructuring. At a time when we hear renewed calls for a referendum. At a time when we hear of protests and tear gassing of protesters. At a time when we hear dangerous murmurs of secession. Even the vocabulary of war is seeping into everyday language. Only a few weeks ago, for example, the photograph of a house that was set on fire somewhere in the Southeast was posted on Twitter. The person who posted it claimed it was the house of a saboteur, a word that I had only associated with people of my parents' generation when they spoke of the Civil War. So on further reflection, maybe the theme of this conference, in such a time as this, with the chaos and the protests and the arrests and the pandemic, maybe the theme of this conference doesn't seem as contradictory as I initially thought. Reimagining belongingness in 21st century Africa. It is exactly apt, because reimagination, reform, and renewal always involve chaos. There has to be a certain level of destruction, and then from the ruin, something different and whole appears. And we are living witnesses to this, aren't we? The status quo has been shaken, and circumstances have made it imperative for all of us, people of all ages, to learn to create new ways of organizing and imagining life, whatever that life is. Every one of us has had to be creative in finding ways to navigate this new world. I have titled my talk, The African Writer in the 21st Century, an appeal for radical imagination. My title might perhaps come across as tongue-in-cheek, because how can one essentialize a continent of more than 1 billion people, spread over 54 countries? How do we distill writers from 54 countries, writing in several languages, into the single entity, an African writer? Yet the question of who or what an African writer is an enduring one. The question of identity and the African writer was at the forefront of the first African Writers' Conference 59 years ago. In June 1962, with much of Africa getting their independence, 23 nations by then, and in July, Algeria will become the 24th to do so after a bloody war with France. The first African Writers' Conference was held at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. And the conference was to discuss the African writer's role on a continent that was changing. It was called Conference of African Writers of English Expression, effectively excluding non-English writing African writers, and which Ngugi wa Thiong'o, 28 years old then, and known as James Ngugi, pointed out as problematic. He asked, how could there be an African Writers Conference comprising only of Anglophone African writers? And could you be African if it was written in English? The writers at the conference couldn't agree on the parameters of what made one an African writer. And perhaps if they had, we wouldn't be in this conundrum today. But the easy definition which I use, and which I call the Kane-Price definition, is that an African writer is a writer who is from Africa, period. An easy enough definition, and the only one that makes sense as far as I'm concerned, but not one I have always accepted, because I realized rather early on that the term African writer does not come unencumbered. And so at the beginning of my career, I always insisted that I was just a writer, not a woman writer, not a Nigerian writer, not an Igbo writer, just a writer. Any appellation to writer seemed to me to shrink rather than to magnify my identity. And there was a particular anxiety to being tagged an African writer. And that anxiety, which I have since unburdened myself of, is not unfounded, because often that term has little to do with geography than it does with what outsiders, in many cases, have decided that an African writer is. Or perhaps I should say what they've decided an African writer writes. And accepting the identity meant that I was accepting that readers could make general assumptions about my work before they had read a single word. It meant accepting that I was writing a certain kind of way, that I was overly concerned with certain themes, and that my work would be enjoyed only by those who enjoyed African literature, as if readers of African literature were a monolithic group with a monomaniac obsession with a single African story. It is entirely possible that my anxiety was made worse by the fact that I began writing in Europe and had already, before I was even published, been subjected to what being an African writer in that space entailed. So for instance, the first festival I was invited to give a reading of a commissioned short story at was in the city I lived in. And at a preliminary meeting to discuss my contribution, I was asked to bring a tam-tam to my reading to make it more authentic. I had no idea then what a tam-tam was. I mean, we don't say tam-tam in Nigeria. And besides, why should I bring a drum to a reading? It doesn't make sense. So on the day of the festival, I also discovered that my reading room had been decorated with wooden sculptures. And instead of chairs, there were mats for my audience to sit on and get the full African experience. When my first novel was acquired by a Belgian publisher, I was eager, understandably, to put as much distance as I could between myself and the tag African writer. After the novel came out and I gave a reading tour, the question of identity consistently came up. My Africanness was questioned by readers who have been on safaris and holidays to Africa and did not see the Africa they know represented in my stories of chaotic urban spaces without a lion in sight and a protagonist who has never seen a hut. They couldn't reconcile what they read with what they knew of Africa. And one said to me, "Your character has a shower inside her house. I didn't see that in Africa." Often the questions I was asked had little to do with the novel I was promoting, a novel about a Nigerian woman in an interracial relationship with a Belgian man and dealing with the devastating loss of a child. I had experimented with form, writing the novel in both first person and second person. But often the questions I got were more anthropological in nature than literary. So for instance, I'll be asked, how many languages are spoken in Nigeria? What is its topography? What's the predominant religion in Nigeria? And when the questions were not anthropological, they were uncommonly invasive. How many children do you have? How old are you? How did you meet your husband? It was almost as if there was a reluctance to read the novel as a work of art, to extend to it the same courtesy, for want of a better word, that other novels by Western writers got. Confrontations like this helped me realize over time that by disavowing the African writer identity, I was contributing to this idea that African writing fit into this neat, easily recognizable box that was somehow still stuck in some primitive, some might say somehow innocent past, and that any writer from Africa who did not write like that was no longer an African writer. A willingness to flatten my identity into that of a writer, rather than specifically an African writer, was saying that I had transcended someone else's ridiculous notion of what an African writer was, rather than saying that the idea itself, the idea of this box, which excluded certain kinds of writing, was nonsensical, which in actual fact it is. I have come to find this flattening into a global identity where we are all writers, devoid of national or cultural identities, is problematic, both for its blandness and for the way it subsumes African literature. No one hears global culture and thinks African. In Igbo, we say, "Nke a bụ nke anyị." This one is ours. Let us keep it so. Whatever we write is African literature. Now, while the question of my authenticity as an African writer by my Belgian readers was aimed at the content of my works, on the continent, the identity question is often weaponized by fellow Africans to question my authenticity as African. Our bodies as diasporic Africans, as hyphenated Africans, are not always allowed to fully belong in the spaces we find ourselves in, and it is painful. But the pain is worse when the place you call home questions your right to belongingness to. The first time I was asked by a reader in Lagos how I could consider myself an African writer if I did not live in Africa, I fumbled for an answer. Of course, underlying the question was really, if I did not live his realities in Nigeria, if I was ensconced in Europe, how could I claim to be African? And by extension, how dare I write Africa? And for whom do I write my Africa? For whom do you write? That's not an unusual question, and we know this as writers. Writers are very often asked that. Who is your audience? So for us African writers writing from outside Africa, or African writers living on the continent and published in the West, the question is more nuanced than it would appear. African critics of Afro-diasporic writers, or critics of African writers whose works are bought by Western presses, frequently criticize the writers for pandering to the West. We hear terms like poverty porn, writing what sells, writing for the Western gaze, all of which assume that the only valid reader is the Western reader who has to be consciously courted. The erasure of the African reader, whether at home or abroad, as an audience that the writer may be courting, has consequences in the way especially younger writers on the continent approach, the erasure of the African reader at home or abroad as an audience that the writer may be courting has consequences in the way especially younger writers on the continent approach writing and publication. There is the notion that unless one is published internationally in the UK or the US, that one has failed. Every time I have taught a workshop in Nigeria, talented young writers, even those with the prospect of finding a good house in Nigeria, are more interested in being published in the West. Of course, I understand the desire. To be published abroad is to position yourself towards a level of global consciousness that may see your books in airport bookstores in London and New York and Melbourne and Johannesburg, and that is not a bad thing. In fact, one of the things I enjoy doing at airports is book browsing. And in the past 10, 12, 15 years, I have noticed that I'm spotting more African books in spaces where I never used to spot them before. And I take particular pride in seeing these books in these spaces. There is a criticism that the books that Western publishers, especially the bigger houses, want from Africans are the ones that are easily consumable, easily sellable to the Western reader. The Afropolitan literature or literature of war and suffering, books that present the image of an urban Africa that is recognizable for being similar to the urban spaces of the West, what is also sometimes called international literature, or an Africa that is similar to the pictures used in TV advertisements and on brochure covers by well-meaning Westerners raising aid for Africa. So narratives of the extreme. And yes, in a world where the gatekeepers of literature, from agents to commissioning editors, is populated debatably mostly by old white men with particular tastes, there is the real danger that their taste shapes what is considered real African literature. They have the yam, they have the knife, they have the plate. What they serve is what is eaten. They decide what the canon is. The Venerable Chinua Achebe rejected the idea that he was the father of modern African literature, a title given to him in what Soyinka calls a momentary fit of exuberance by the late South African writer Nadine Gordimer. In one of his essays, Achebe recounts being referred to as the inventor of African literature, a title given to him by an Irish critic, another well-meaning outsider, and a title that Achebe disavowed. He's quick to point out in the essay, though, that his disavowal had little to do with humility, but rather with the fact that in his Igbo culture, art is not owned by a single person. Creativity is a communal enterprise, and it is sacrilegious for one to lay proprietary claim to it. All this to say, really, that when outsiders are deciding the African literary canon for us, they are bound to not get it completely right. That is not to say that the visibility of African writing at the moment, mostly thanks to the West, is a bad thing. As more African writers are published by commercial presses in the West and winning international prizes, African writing is moving steadily away from the margins to the center. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is a recognizable name to readers and teachers of writing globally. Akweke Emezi was on a recent cover of Time magazine. Mbolo Mbue got $1 million advance for her debut a couple of years ago. Nnedi Okorafor is collaborating with Viola Davis on the screenplay of Octavia Butler's Seed, and her Who Fears Death is set to come on HBO. Uwem Akpan was on Oprah some years ago. Tendai Huchu has just published the first of his YA fantasy series and is getting critical acclaim for it. Francesca Ekuyasi's debut was longlisted for Canada's most prestigious prize and shortlisted for the country's 2020 Governor General's Award for English Fiction. Chibundu Onuzo's third novel has just been published by Virago. Nathan John and Abubakar Adam Ibrahim are frequent guests at literary festivals across the globe. Martha Mengiste and Sisi Dangeremba were on this year's Booker shortlist. Bolu Babalola's debut is a bestseller. Okezie Nwaka's debut is coming out in November from one of the big fives. Samuel Kolawole is a writing faculty at one of the top schools, and this before even his debut has come out from another big five. Lola Akinmade Akestrom's In Every Mirror She is Black is racking up critical acclaim. Cheluchi Onyemelukonobia's debut is out now in Canada and the US. Chigozie Obioma is teaching a guided masterclass. He's been on the Booker Prize shortlist twice, and he's judging the Booker Prize this year. Ukamakole Odisakwe's Ogadimma has been called a feminist classic. Kasimma Okani's All Shades of Iberibe is out in the US this year, Abidare's The Girl with the Louding Voice was on bestseller lists, as was Tola Rotimi Abraham's Black Sunday. And I could go on and on. Bear in mind that I've only mentioned mostly Nigerian writers, and I haven't even listed them all. Yet, we know that it hasn't always been so. To any African writer coming of age now, this must seem normal, the way of the world. Yet, we know that, that it hasn't always been so. In the early years of African literature, commercial publishers and bookstores paid little to no attention to writing from the continent. African writers were published mostly by academic publishers or by publishers dedicated to African books, like the Heinemann African series. These were books meant to be studied. They were expected to carry the burden of explaining a continent's cultures and politics and people, of explaining the humanity of the African. Western readers read them through an anthropological lens rather than for fun. Every American I know, for example, who has read Achebe, read him at school. And I say every American, but also almost every Nigerian of a certain age I know who has read Achebe, and Things Fall Apart particularly, first read it for school. Their introduction to it wasn't as a novel to be enjoyed the way they did his European and American contemporaries, but a text to study, a text to write exams over, a text to be educated by. And that too, in a way, was my experience. One of my favorite anecdotes to tell is of discovering Things Fall Apart as a young girl. It was a set text for one of my older siblings, and I borrowed it to read. And for the first time in my life, I was confronted in a book with the narrative of an Africa that existed before colonization. And I saw for the first time in a book, colonization presented as a disrupting event. Before then, thanks to my social studies lessons on the discoveries of Mungo Park and Co. and the magnanimity of Florence Nightingale and the like, I had always imagined that colonization was a benign project that benefited the blighted Africans. Whatever history I learned of Nigeria began with its amalgamation and its naming by Flora Shaw. When I tried to comprehend or to imagine a Nigeria before its naming by this woman, I was met with a void. I couldn't comprehend of a Nigeria before the amalgamation. Incidentally, too, not long before I read Things Fall Apart, some adults who knew of my proclivity for reading when I read everything had given me a Christian book to read. That book, which I now know much later in hindsight to have been a white supremacist tract, basically theorized that the mark God lay on the murderous Cain for killing his brother Abel was the black Cain. And so Black people, in being the descendants of the cursed Cain, would never escape their fate: bad governments, famine, war, and would never make heaven. I was a voracious reader at that age. I was maybe 8 or 9, but I wasn't mature enough to be discriminating in my reading or to interrogate what I'd read. As far as I was concerned, the written word was true and sacred. I wanted to make heaven where my mother told me I could have as much vanilla ice cream as I wanted. And I thought it unjust that despite my being good, I wouldn't make it because of Cain. Reading that tract tilted my world, but Things Fall Apart tilted it right back, even with its imperfect characters. And that is what fiction does. It creates a balance of stories. It fills the world with a multiplicity of voices, even when we are writing out of the same continent or when we share the same national and cultural identities. Which is why it is ludicrous for anyone to attempt to read African writers as a homogeneous whole, or to see the term African writer as harboring a meaning deeper than a pointer to geography. It is this kind of reading that we reject in these times of global cultural flux, when we in our diverse voices say, I am an African writer. Our polyphony of voices make up the African writer, but we are not one. and neither are our stories. Indiscriminately flattening literature into boxes based on where one is from can lead to the kind of situation we had here in the States. So in the wake of the George Floyd murder and all the conversations here about race and social justice, many well-meaning progressives put out lists of must-read books, all by Black authors, to understand the Black experience. It is ridiculous to think that a white American would need to read, say, Namwali Sepel's Brilliant Old Drift set in Zambia to understand the racial politics of the United States and to develop some empathy for oppressed Black lives. Or read, say, Brian Chukwava's Harare North about a Zimbabwean refugee in London to understand police brutality. These calls were well intended, but they treated writing by African and African American writers like vitamin supplements, something one reads, not because one wants to, but because it is good for one. It is tempting to say that anything that sells books is a good thing, even lazily drawn up arbitrary lists that were flying around in the wake of Floyd's death. Writers hope for the kind of success such sales may bring them. It is the same type of temptation for success, more particularly for international success, that I suspect is at the heart of the question, how can I be published abroad? When the young writers in my workshop in Nigeria ask that question, what they are really asking is, should we allow the possibility of international success shape what and how we write? Should we be writing with an export market in mind? Should we be writing with a Western readership in mind? The answer, of course, is no. No good literature could ever come out of such. Good literature comes out of a radical imagination. What we need is a radical imagination of what is possible. Lagos and Johannesburg and Nairobi as publishing centers of the world. And why not? Let the West come to us for what is the best in African writing. At the moment, the African writers that are lauded are the ones that have been published abroad, even if they are never published in Africa. My people say that na ana malo manimuno tupa malo maputezi. So let us imagine a future where publishing in Nigeria, in Africa, is as desirable as publishing in Europe or America. Thankfully, some contemporary houses are already answering the call. Cassava Republic, Reader, Farafina, Paresia, Narrative Landscapes, Masobe have all sprouted in recent times in Nigeria alone to fill in the gap for good quality indigenous presses. Books by some of these houses are released in the UK and US as well, and thanks to the internet, have worldwide accessibility. Cassava Republic has also just published their first book in translation, a novel by the Algerian writer Faiza Gwen, translated from French. And Reader is releasing Isi Osondo's new novel. It is a sign of what is possible when dreams align with quality. Quality, of course, the operative word here. In 2009, I was on the Kim Prize shortlist, and as part of the many events we did, we had a meeting with the powerhouse that was Buchie Mecheta. One of the things that she told us that has stuck, apart from how we should never be embarrassed to want to live off of our writing, to make money from our writing, was how every time she went to Nigeria, she was inundated with books by Nigerian writers published in Nigeria. These writers, she said, wanted her to find them a publisher in the UK. Sadly, she said, the final product, not necessarily the content, but the final product was so shoddy, she was too ashamed to give them to anyone and often would dump the books at the airport. And I understand her. I have bought books published by some of the older publishing houses, which shall remain unnamed in Nigeria, and I have struggled to read the text. Sometimes the words on the page seem to be doing a special calisthenics of their own, completely unrelated to the intention of the writer. In sales parlance, packaging matters as much as what is inside the package. Presentation matters. The Igbo would say, the eye eats first before the mouth eats. What we need is a radical imagination of what is possible. Every year, we wait breathlessly to hear who's won the Booker Prize and who's won the King Prize and who's won the Women's Prize. We hear how these prizes transform the career of their winners. They are catapulted, if they're not already, into the global limelight. When I was a child, I learned the phrase, the cynosure of all eyes. I mean, it's not a phrase I use at all these days, but it is the one that most readily comes to mind when I think of some of these international prizes, who do not even give as much financial compensation as some of our own African prizes. We must be able to imagine a future where the Nigeria Prize for Literature and the Etisalat Prize and Anna Prize and other homegrown prizes carry the gravitas and influence of the Booker Prize, where every bookstore in the English-speaking world wants to carry the winning book, and non-Anglophone publishers reach out for translation rights. What we need is a radical imagination of what is possible. More writing across all genres, challenging the single story of Africa. Let us have the child soldiers and the wars and the famine and the dictatorships and the runs girls, because whether we like it or not, they exist. But let us not have only those. Let us have the high rises and the high flyers who get luxury cars for their birthdays from their indulgent fathers. Let us have ice cream and cake and ACs and Banana Island. They exist too. But let us not have only those. We need feminist stories, stories of love, romance novels, stories of wealth and poverty, corruption and magic and beauty and darkness, stories about the ways in which we are dealing with post-colonial trauma, stories about obsession and selfish mothers and absent fathers, stories about bad children. Let us write narratives that reckon with issues of class and capitalism and religion and nationalism and gender. Everything, the totality and multiplicity of the people and the stories that make up Africa. Let us have all of these stories. Let us not be bullied one way or the other into setting our stories in spaces of one-dimensional Africa, good or bad. What we need is a radical imagination of what is possible. The world is at an inflection point. Rising from the ashes of this pandemic that has upended everything, let us dare to imagine a better Nigeria, a better Africa, a better world, a more equitable place for everyone, for those historically marginalized, the poor, the girl child, the woman. In Igbo culture, the artist is divine. All artists, not just writers, regardless of their standing, carry the responsibility of creating order. Where there's an imbalance, they must restore order. That is their role. Our works, our writings remain important outlets, not just to critique the moment, but also to articulate the fears that we face today, and especially to shine the torch to a more inclusive future. As Toni Morrison reminds us, and she could have been speaking of our present pandemic world, quote, "This is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal," end of quote. Let us go forth and be unapologetically and radiantly imaginative, resisting the temptation to write in response to a demand that we think exists. Let us resist the temptation to write to please any market. When we imagine our audience, let that audience be people like us, our community, people we do not need to teach Africa or explain Africa to. It is in so doing that we can allow ourselves to create truthfully and freely. In other words, let us write assuming knowledge. And let us give ourselves the freedom to dream radically and dream big. We are alchemists after all. Thank you very much.